They burst into laughter the moment Commander Alexis Kane walked into the armory carrying what looked like a toy. A bright crimson rifle that gleamed under the fluorescent lights like some kind of custom paintball gun rather than military hardware. The seasoned operators at Fort Meridian couldn't contain themselves. Here was their new marksmanship instructor, a 29-year-old woman barely clearing 5'4", clutching what appeared to be the most unprofessional weapon they'd ever seen in active service. "What is that thing?" Staff Sergeant Bruno Vasquez snorted, nudging his buddy with an elbow. "Did someone order that from a video game catalog?" Captain Reed Holloway, a barrel-chested veteran with 22 years of conventional warfare under his belt, shook his head in open disbelief. "Command's really scraping the bottom if they think we need some rookie with a painted peashooter teaching us how to shoot. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." The Crimson Rifle was indeed unusual. A modified Barrett M82A1 that Kane had personally customized during her 8 years with the 75th Ranger Regiment's long-range surveillance units. The deep red coating wasn't just for show. It was a specialized polymer that reduced heat signature and glare reflection. Innovations she developed after watching too many snipers get compromised by scope glint and barrel heat shimmer. But to these operators, it looked like nothing more than an attention-seeking gimmick. Lieutenant Sarah Cross, the only other woman in the room, watched the scene unfold with growing discomfort. She'd heard whispers about Kane's unconventional methods and stellar record, but seeing the open mockery made her stomach clench. The men weren't even trying to hide their disdain. "I bet she can't even handle the recoil," muttered Corporal Jake Morrison, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Probably fires blanks with that toy." Kane said nothing. She'd learned long ago that defending her equipment choices only invited more ridicule. Instead, she methodically began setting up her gear, checking each component with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times under much worse conditions. Her movements were precise, economical, betraying none of the frustration that simmered beneath her calm exterior. The mockery continued as she worked. Someone made a joke about the rifle matching her lipstick, though Kane wore none. Another suggested she'd gotten lost on her way to a costume party. The laughter echoed off the concrete walls of the range facility, each chuckle a reminder that despite her record, despite her capabilities, she was still seen as an outsider in this brotherhood of warriors. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that in exactly 3 hours their comfortable assumptions would be shattered forever. At 1,347 hours that afternoon, the base alarm system would shriek across Fort Meridian's training grounds. A specialized exercise would commence that was designed to test the absolute limits of marksmanship under stress, something called the Gauntlet Protocol. 47 drone targets would launch simultaneously from multiple directions, each programmed with evasive maneuvers, varying speeds, and unpredictable flight patterns. These weren't stationary bullseyes or predictable clay pigeons. They were advanced military-grade UAVs designed to simulate the most challenging shooting scenarios imaginable. The exercise had been attempted 17 times in the past 3 years by the military's most elite marksmen. The best performance on record was 23 targets eliminated before ammunition ran out. Most shooters managed fewer than 15. The drones moved too fast, changed direction too suddenly, and the time pressure was simply too intense for human reflexes to keep pace. But on this particular afternoon, as those same laughing officers and NCOs watched in stunned silence, Commander Alexis Kane would achieve something that would be talked about in military circles for decades to come. That bright red rifle they'd mocked would speak 47 times in the span of 8 minutes and 32 seconds. Each shot would find its mark. Each target would tumble from the sky in a shower of sparks and metal fragments. Not a single miss. Not one wasted round. 47 moving targets, 47 perfect hits, and a silence so complete that you could hear the brass casings hitting the concrete like distant church bells marking the end of an era. When the last drone crashed into the sand berms at the far end of the range, Staff Sergeant Vasquez would find himself unable to speak. Captain Holloway would remove his cap and run his hand through his graying hair, searching for words that didn't exist. Lieutenant Cross would stand with her mouth open, realizing she'd just witnessed something that would redefine what was possible in her chosen profession. But that was still 3 hours away. For now, Kane simply continued her equipment check, ignoring the snickers and whispered comments. She'd spent too many years proving herself to waste energy on words. The red rifle gleamed under the lights, and somewhere in the back of her mind, she was already calculating wind patterns, target velocities, and the dozens of variables that would soon separate the possible from the impossible. The laughter would stop soon enough. It always did, because when the impossible becomes routine, when perfection becomes repeatable, when a woman with a red rifle demonstrates capabilities that transcend every assumption about human limitations, well, that's when mockery dies and legends are born. But first, let me tell you exactly how we got there. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Meridian's sprawling training complex, a testament to modern military precision nestled in the harsh terrain of Nevada's Blackstone Desert. This wasn't just any base. It was the home of the Advanced Marksmanship Development Center, where the military's most elite shooters came to push the boundaries of what was humanly possible with a rifle. Commander Alexis Kane stepped off the transport vehicle with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned their place through blood, sweat, and an almost supernatural ability to put rounds exactly where they needed to go. At 29, she carried herself with the measured grace of a predator, every movement economical and purposeful. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her gray-green eyes held the kind of steady focus that came from years of looking through high-powered scopes at targets that most people couldn't even see. What made Kane truly unusual wasn't just her gender in a predominantly male field, or even her relatively compact frame in a profession that typically favored larger, more physically imposing figures. It was her background. Most instructors at Fort Meridian came from traditional sniper schools, following established doctrines that had been refined over decades. Kane, however, had forged her own path through 8 years with the 75th Ranger Regiment's most classified units, developing techniques that military academics called unconventional and field operators called miraculous. The crimson rifle slung across her back told its own story. Every military marksman at Fort Meridian carried weapons that looked the part, matte black, olive drab, or desert tan finishes that screamed professional lethality. Kane's Barrett M82A1, however, gleamed like a ruby in sunlight. The custom red polymer coating wasn't a fashion statement. It was the result of 3 years of materials science research she'd conducted during downtime between deployments. The coating reduced thermal signature by 37% and eliminated scope glint entirely, innovations that had saved her life more times than she cared to count. But to the assembled instructors and students waiting outside the range facility, it looked like a toy. New blood, muttered Staff Sergeant Bruno Vasquez, a stocky Mexican-American with forearms like tree trunks and a handlebar mustache that belonged in a different century. He'd been teaching marksmanship at Fort Meridian for 6 years, long enough to see dozens of revolutionary instructors come and go. Bet she doesn't last 2 weeks before washing out. Captain Reed Holloway stood beside him, arms folded across his chest as he studied Kane's approach. At 45, Holloway was Fort Meridian's senior instructor, a living legend who'd served in every major conflict of the past 2 decades. His reputation was built on traditional methods, proven techniques, and an unwavering belief that marksmanship was about discipline, repetition, and respect for established doctrine. The sight of Kane's unconventional weapon made his jaw tighten. "Command's been pushing diversity quotas," he said quietly, though not quietly enough. "Looks like they finally found someone willing to play along." Lieutenant Sarah Cross shifted uncomfortably nearby. As one of only 3 women stationed at Fort Meridian, she'd heard variations of this conversation before. But something about Kane was different. The way she moved, the way she carried herself. This wasn't someone playing games or filling quotas. This was a professional who'd earned her place, even if the others couldn't see it yet. Kane reached the group and set down her equipment case with practiced precision. She'd heard the whispers, caught the sideways glances, felt the weight of their skepticism like a physical presence. After 8 years in special operations, she was used to walking into rooms where she had to prove herself before anyone would take her seriously. The difference was that today, she had the luxury of time and a controlled environment to do it properly. "Morning," she said simply, her voice carrying the slight rasp that came from years of calling shots in dusty, hostile environments. I'm Commander Kane. I'll be running advanced precision courses for the next 6 months. The silence that followed wasn't hostile exactly, but it wasn't welcoming either. It was the kind of polite skepticism that military professionals reserved for situations where they had to be respectful but weren't convinced they should be. Sergeant First Class Tommy Rodriguez, a wiry Texan with 20 years of infantry experience, was the first to speak. Ma'am, with respect, what's your background? Most of us here learned from the best schools, Scout Sniper, Special Operations Target Interdiction Course, Advanced Urban Marksmanship. Where'd you train? It was a fair question, professionally asked, though Kane could hear the underlying challenge. Rodriguez wasn't trying to be dismissive. He genuinely wanted to know if she belonged in their world. Ranger School, Survival Evasion Resistance Escape, Advanced Individual Training at Fort Benning, she replied, ticking off the standard qualifications. Then 8 years with the 75th, primarily in long-range surveillance and target interdiction roles. 43 confirmed eliminations across 4 deployments, average engagement distance just over 800 meters. The numbers were impressive, and she could see some of the skepticism fade from their faces. But then Corporal Jake Morrison, a young Marine with more attitude than experience, gestured toward her rifle. And the paint job, ma'am? Is that part of some new tactical doctrine? Kane had been expecting this question. She'd been answering variations of it for 3 years, ever since she'd first fielded the modified weapon. The coating reduces thermal signature and eliminates reflective glare, she said evenly. Field tested across multiple environments. It's functional, not decorative. Morrison's smirk suggested he wasn't convinced, but before he could respond, Captain Holloway stepped forward. His expression was carefully neutral, the face of a man who'd decided to reserve judgment until he had more information. Commander Kane, he said formally, welcome to Fort Meridian. I understand you'll be implementing some new training methodologies. The way he said new made it sound like a communicable disease, but Kane nodded respectfully. That's correct, Captain. Integration of biomechanical analysis, advanced ballistic computation, and stress inoculation protocols. The goal is to push precision accuracy beyond current baseline performance. Holloway's eyebrows rose slightly. The terminology was impressive, but terminology was easy. Results were what mattered in his world. And you believe your methods will show measurable improvement over established doctrine? Kane met his gaze steadily. I know they will, sir. The question is whether your people are ready to challenge their assumptions about what's possible. The words hung in the morning air like a thrown gauntlet. Around them, the other instructors exchanged glances. This wasn't the deferential approach they'd expected from someone walking into their domain. This was confidence bordering on arrogance, and in their world, such confidence had better be backed up with extraordinary capability. What none of them realized was that in less than 3 hours, they would discover exactly how extraordinary that capability truly was. The morning briefing at Fort Meridian's Advanced Marksmanship Development Center was supposed to be routine, a standard introduction to new training protocols and quarterly assessment updates. But at 0930 hours, everything changed when Colonel Patricia Hawthorne strode into the main conference room with an expression that made seasoned veterans straighten in their chairs. Colonel Hawthorne was not a woman who dealt in dramatics. 52 years old, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe bun and the kind of bearing that came from 3 decades of military service, she commanded respect through competence rather than theatrics. When she spoke, people listened. When she looked concerned, people worried. And this morning, she looked very concerned indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, she began without preamble. We have a situation that requires immediate attention. I've just received word from Pentagon Strategic Assessment Division that our marksmanship performance metrics have fallen below acceptable standards for elite unit readiness. The room fell silent. Fort Meridian prided itself on producing the military's finest marksmen, and hearing that their standards were slipping felt like a professional slap in the face. Specifically, Hawthorne continued, pulling up a holographic display that showed declining accuracy statistics. Our advanced shooters are struggling with dynamic target engagement scenarios. Moving targets, multiple simultaneous threats, high-stress environmental conditions, areas where our adversaries are showing marked improvement while we plateau. Staff Sergeant Vasquez shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He'd noticed the trend in recent training exercises but had attributed it to increasingly difficult scenarios rather than declining capability. The problem, Hawthorne explained, is that our current training doctrine, while excellent for static precision shooting, hasn't evolved to meet modern battlefield requirements. Today's conflicts demand marksmen who can engage multiple moving targets in rapid succession while maintaining perfect accuracy under extreme stress. She gestured to the data streaming across the display. Intelligence suggests that hostile forces are employing increasingly sophisticated drone swarm tactics, coordinated vehicle movements, and rapid deployment strategies that our current marksmen simply cannot counter effectively. We're training World War II snipers for Star Wars battles. Captain Holloway cleared his throat. Colonel, with respect, our methods have been proven over decades of combat. Traditional marksmanship principles are insufficient. Hawthorne cut him off firmly. Which brings me to why Commander Kane is here. All eyes turned to Kane, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the room, taking notes and observing the group dynamics. She felt the weight of their attention but kept her expression neutral. The Pentagon has given us exactly 30 days to demonstrate significant improvement in dynamic target engagement, Hawthorne continued. If we cannot show measurable progress, this facility will lose its designation as the military's premier marksmanship training center. That means reduced funding, personnel transfers, and the very real possibility that Fort Meridian becomes just another basic rifle qualification center. The implications hit the room like a physical blow. These men and women had dedicated their careers to being the best, to pushing the boundaries of human accuracy. The thought of being reduced to teaching recruits how to hit stationary targets at 100 meters was professionally devastating. Commander Kane, Hawthorne said, turning to address her directly, has been brought in specifically to address this challenge. Her methods, while unconventional, have produced results that Pentagon analysts consider promising. Lieutenant Cross leaned forward in her chair. What kind of results, ma'am? Hawthorne pulled up a new display showing Kane's service record. During Operation Desert Falcon, Commander Kane successfully engaged 17 enemy combatants moving in coordinated vehicles across varied terrain in under 4 minutes. Perfect accuracy, 0 civilian casualties. Mission completed with minimal ammunition expenditure. The numbers were impressive, but Corporal Morrison wasn't convinced. Ma'am, 17 targets in 4 minutes is certainly good. But that's not all, Hawthorne interrupted. 3 months later, during the evacuation of Forward Operating Base Viper, Commander Kane eliminated 23 hostile drones in a coordinated swarm attack. The drones were specifically designed to overwhelm traditional defensive measures through speed and unpredictable movement patterns. The room went quiet. Drone swarm tactics were relatively new to the battlefield, and successfully countering them required capabilities that most marksmen couldn't even comprehend, let alone execute. How? Asked Sergeant Rodriguez, his skepticism giving way to genuine curiosity. Anti-drone systems use automated targeting. Human reflexes aren't fast enough to track that many moving objects simultaneously. Kane spoke for the first time since the briefing began. Human reflexes aren't, but human pattern recognition is. The key is learning to read movement algorithms rather than tracking individual targets. The statement was cryptic enough to generate confused glances around the room. But before anyone could ask for clarification, Hawthorne continued with her presentation. The assessment protocol is straightforward, she explained. In exactly 72 hours, this facility will host a demonstration exercise designed to test our enhanced capabilities. Representatives from 3 different Pentagon divisions will observe, along with senior officers from Special Operations Command. She paused to let the weight of that information settle. Having Pentagon observers was career-defining territory, the kind of opportunity that could make reputations or destroy them. The exercise will involve the new Gauntlet Protocol, Hawthorne said, and Kane noticed several people shift nervously. 47 drone targets launched simultaneously, each programmed with advanced evasive maneuvers. The current military record for this exercise is 23 eliminations before ammunition depletion. Captain Holloway frowned. Colonel, with respect, that record was set by Master Sergeant Jenkins from Delta Force. He's considered one of the finest marksmen in military history. Expecting our people to exceed that performance isn't negotiable, Hawthorne finished firmly. Pentagon has made it clear that marginal improvement won't be sufficient. They want dramatic demonstration of enhanced capability. She turned back to Kane. Commander Kane has assured me that her training methods can produce a marksman capable of achieving perfect performance on the Gauntlet protocol. The silence that followed was deafening. Perfect performance meant 47 targets eliminated, 47 moving, evasive drones destroyed without a single miss. It was the kind of achievement that bordered on impossible, the stuff of video games rather than reality. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Cross said carefully, "has anyone ever achieved perfect performance on the Gauntlet protocol?" "No," Hawthorne replied bluntly. "Which is why success will guarantee Fort Meridian's continued status as the premier marksmanship facility in the world." She closed the display and looked around the room. "Commander Kane will have full authority to implement whatever training modifications she deems necessary. You will provide complete cooperation and an open mind regarding her methods." As if reading their thoughts, she added, "I understand that change is uncomfortable, especially when it challenges long-held beliefs about proven techniques. But I'd rather risk discomfort than guarantee failure." The room began to buzz with quiet conversations as the implications sank in. 72 hours to demonstrate impossible performance under Pentagon observation. Their careers, their facility's reputation, everything they'd worked for riding on the success of training methods none of them understood. Kane remained silent, observing the dynamics. She could see the fear in their eyes, the uncertainty about whether she could deliver what she'd promised. What they didn't know was that she'd already achieved perfect performance on the Gauntlet protocol twice. But those demonstrations had been classified, conducted under controlled conditions with Pentagon observers who'd signed non-disclosure agreements so restrictive that the results couldn't be shared. The question wasn't whether she could do it again. The question was whether she could do it in front of this audience, under these conditions, with everyone watching and waiting for her to fail. In 72 hours, they would have their answer. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife as Commander Kane finished explaining her proposed training modifications. For the past hour, she had methodically outlined techniques that challenged every fundamental principle the Fort Meridian instructors had spent their careers mastering. Biomechanical synchronization protocols, predictive targeting algorithms, stress-induced hyperperformance conditioning, concepts that sounded more like science fiction than military doctrine. Captain Holloway sat rigidly in his chair, his weathered hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. 22 years of military service had taught him to respect chain of command, but what he was hearing violated every instinct he'd developed about proper marksmanship training. When Kane finally paused to take questions, he could no longer contain himself. "Commander," he said, his voice carefully controlled but edged with steel. "With all due respect, what you're proposing isn't marksmanship training. It's experimental psychology masquerading as tactical doctrine." Kane had been expecting this response. She'd seen it in every facility she'd visited, every time she tried to introduce methods that challenged traditional thinking. "Captain Holloway, could you elaborate on your specific concerns?" "My concerns." Holloway stood up, his considerable frame imposing in the fluorescent lighting. "You want our shooters to abandon sight picture fundamentals, ignore established breathing techniques, and trust some kind of intuitive targeting system that you claim will make them superhuman. That's not training, Commander. That's wishful thinking." Staff Sergeant Vasquez nodded vigorously from across the room. "The captain's right. We've been teaching proven methods for decades. Marines have been winning battles with traditional marksmanship since World War I. You can't just throw that away because some Pentagon analyst thinks we need to be more innovative." Kane remained seated, her posture relaxed despite the obvious hostility building around her. "Sergeant Vasquez, how many of your students can consistently hit moving targets at ranges beyond 600 meters? That's not the point." "It's exactly the point," Kane interrupted calmly. Traditional methods work beautifully for static targets under controlled conditions. But modern threats don't stand still and wait to be shot. They move unpredictably, coordinate their movements, and employ countermeasures specifically designed to defeat conventional marksmanship. Lieutenant Cross shifted uncomfortably in her seat. As someone who'd struggled with advanced moving target scenarios, she found Kane's words uncomfortably accurate. But the hostility in the room was making her nervous. Corporal Morrison, emboldened by his superior's objections, leaned forward aggressively. "Commander, no disrespect intended, but you're asking us to throw away everything we know based on your word that these experimental techniques work. How do we know this isn't just theoretical nonsense that looks good on paper but fails in practice?" Kane studied Morrison for a moment, noting the challenge in his posture and the way the other instructors were watching to see how she'd respond. This was the moment she'd been dreading, when skepticism turned to outright rebellion and her authority would be tested. "Corporal Morrison," she said quietly, "what would constitute proof that these methods work?" Morrison glanced at Holloway, clearly seeking guidance. The captain gave an almost imperceptible nod, encouraging him to press forward. "Results, ma'am. Actual performance that demonstrates superiority over established doctrine. And if I could provide such a demonstration, then we'd be obligated to consider your methods," Holloway interjected, his tone making it clear he considered such a demonstration impossible. But understanding theory and executing under pressure are entirely different things. Kane nodded thoughtfully. "Captain, you raise an excellent point about pressure. Traditional training assumes that stress degrades performance, correct? That's why conventional doctrine emphasizes controlled breathing, steady positions, and eliminating variables. Because that's what works," Vasquez said firmly. "Stress makes people sloppy. You minimize stress through discipline and proper fundamentals." "What if you're wrong?" Kane asked quietly. "What if stress, properly channeled, can actually enhance performance rather than degrade it?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. For men and women who'd built their careers on the assumption that combat stress was an enemy to be overcome, the suggestion that it might be a tool to be embraced was almost heretical. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. "Commander, that sounds like adrenaline junkie philosophy. I've seen what stress does to shooters in combat. Heart rates spike, fine motor control degrades, accuracy goes to hell. That's not theory, that's observed reality." Kane stood up for the first time since the meeting began, her movement causing a subtle shift in the room's dynamics. "Sergeant Rodriguez, you're absolutely correct about what happens to most shooters under stress. But what if the problem isn't stress itself, but the way we train people to respond to it?" She walked to the front of the room, where a large display screen showed traditional marksmanship positions and breathing techniques. "Everything you see here is designed to create artificial calm in chaotic situations. But what if, instead of fighting the chaos, we learn to use it?" Holloway's expression darkened. "Commander, you're talking about abandoning decades of proven doctrine based on untested theories. That's not progressive thinking. That's dangerous experimentation with people's lives. Is it more dangerous than sending them into combat with skills that are inadequate for modern threats?" Kane countered. "Because that's what we're doing now. We're training marksmen for yesterday's wars while our enemies prepare for tomorrow's." The accusation stung, particularly because several people in the room suspected it might be true. Recent after-action reports had highlighted concerning trends in marksmanship performance during dynamic engagements, though none of them wanted to admit it publicly. Lieutenant Cross found herself caught between loyalty to her colleagues and curiosity about Kane's claims. "Commander," she said hesitantly, "assuming your methods work, how long would it take to see results?" "The Gauntlet protocol demonstration is in 72 hours. Kane smiled for the first time since entering the room. "Lieutenant Cross, that's an excellent question. Traditional retraining takes months or years because it requires unlearning old habits and building new muscle memory. But what I'm proposing doesn't replace existing skills. It enhances them. In 3 days." Morrison scoffed. "That's impossible." "Is it?" Kane asked. How long does it take an experienced marksman to adjust for wind or elevation? Seconds, because they already know how to process environmental data. What I'm offering is simply new data processing techniques. The explanation sounded reasonable, but Holloway remained unconvinced. Commander, you still haven't addressed the fundamental issue. You're asking us to trust experimental methods with our careers, our reputation, and potentially our students' lives. What happens if these techniques fail during the demonstration? Kane met his gaze directly. Then I accept full responsibility for the failure, and you can return to traditional training with a clear conscience. But Captain, what happens if we stick with current methods and still fail? How will you explain to Colonel Hawthorne that we chose familiar failure over unfamiliar success? The question struck home. Everyone in the room understood the implications of failure during the Pentagon demonstration. Their facility would lose its elite status, funding would be cut, and careers would be damaged. Familiar methods might feel safer, but they offered no guarantee of success. Vasquez looked around the room, reading the uncertainty in his colleagues' faces. So what are you proposing, exactly? That we abandon everything we know and follow your lead based on promises. Kane shook her head. I'm proposing that you give me one volunteer. One experienced marksman willing to learn enhanced techniques and demonstrate their effectiveness. If the results don't speak for themselves, you can reject my methods with clear justification. The offer hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. One volunteer to test unproven methods against impossible standards. The risk was enormous, but so was the potential reward. What none of them realized was that Kane already knew exactly who that volunteer would be, and that in less than 72 hours, everything they believed about human marksmanship capability would be forever changed. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds after Kane's challenge hung in the air. 30 seconds of career calculations, risk assessments, and the kind of internal debate that could define the rest of their professional lives. Finally, from the back corner of the room where she'd been quietly observing the entire exchange, Lieutenant Sarah Cross stood up. I'll volunteer. The words came out steadier than she felt, but once spoken, there was no taking them back. Every head in the room turned toward her, and she could feel the weight of their collective judgment pressing down like a physical force. Captain Holloway's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise, concern, and what might have been disappointment. Lieutenant Cross, I don't think you understand what you're volunteering for. Commander Kane is proposing to completely restructure your marksmanship fundamentals in less than 72 hours, then put you in front of Pentagon observers to attempt something that has never been successfully accomplished. Cross nodded, her throat dry but her voice steady. Yes, sir, I understand the risks, but I also understand that our current methods aren't working for scenarios like the Gauntlet Protocol. If there's a chance to improve, I think we have an obligation to explore it. Staff Sergeant Vasquez leaned forward in his chair, his expression a mixture of concern and incredulity. Sarah, you're talking about staking your career on untested techniques. If this goes bad, it won't just be embarrassing. It could end your military service entirely. And if we stick with current methods and fail anyway? Cross replied, unconsciously echoing Kane's earlier argument. At least this way we're trying to improve rather than just hoping for the best. Corporal Morrison shook his head vigorously. Lieutenant, this is crazy. You're one of the steadiest shooters we have using conventional techniques. Why would you risk throwing that away? The question stung because it touched on something Cross had been struggling with for months. She was indeed steady with conventional techniques, but steady wasn't exceptional. In a facility filled with elite marksmen, she was competent but not remarkable. Good enough to teach basic courses but not trusted with advanced training or special operations support. Because steady isn't enough anymore, she said quietly. I've watched the assessments, seen the scores on dynamic target scenarios. We're all struggling with moving targets, multiple simultaneous engagements, high-stress situations. If Commander Kane's methods can address those weaknesses, then the risk is worth taking. Kane had remained silent during this exchange, watching the group dynamics play out. Cross's volunteer status was exactly what she'd hoped for, but not for the reasons the others might suspect. Kane had studied the personnel files of every instructor at Fort Meridian before arriving, and Cross's profile had stood out immediately. Excellent technical knowledge, superior spatial reasoning scores, and most importantly, a psychological profile that showed high adaptability under stress. Cross wasn't volunteering because she was desperate or reckless. She was volunteering because she had the cognitive flexibility to absorb new techniques quickly. "Lieutenant Cross," Kane said, stepping forward. "Before you commit to this, I need you to understand exactly what you're agreeing to. The training will be intensive, unconventional, and physically demanding. It will require you to temporarily set aside everything you think you know about marksmanship and trust techniques that will feel wrong initially." Cross met her gaze directly. "What specific techniques are we talking about, ma'am?" Kane pulled out a tablet and began displaying biometric data. "First, we'll retrain your stress response. Instead of controlling heart rate and breathing to maintain calm, you'll learn to use elevated physiological states to enhance performance. Your heart rate during the demonstration will likely exceed 140 beats per minute." The room went quiet. Most marksmen considered anything above 100 BPM to be performance-degrading territory. "Second," Kane continued, "we'll abandon traditional sight picture fundamentals in favor of predictive targeting systems. Instead of tracking individual targets, you'll learn to read movement patterns and anticipate positioning." Sergeant Rodriguez frowned deeply. "Commander, that sounds like you're asking her to guess where targets will be instead of aiming where they are." "Not guessing," Kane corrected. "Calculating. Most movement follows predictable algorithms, even when it appears random. The human brain can process these patterns faster than conscious thought if properly trained." Lieutenant Cross found herself leaning forward, genuinely intrigued despite the risks. "How does that work in practice?" Kane smiled, recognizing the spark of curiosity that separated genuine students from skeptical observers. "Have you ever noticed how experienced drivers can navigate through heavy traffic almost without thinking? They're not consciously calculating the speed and trajectory of every other vehicle. They're processing patterns and anticipating movements subconsciously. That's completely different from precision shooting," Captain Holloway interjected firmly. "Driving relies on general awareness and reaction. Marksmanship requires exact precision and conscious control." "Does it?" Kane asked. "How do you acquire targets during rapid engagement sequences? Do you consciously calculate every adjustment, or do experienced marksmen develop an intuitive sense for where their shots need to go?" The question was more penetrating than Holloway wanted to admit. Advanced marksmen did develop what the community called shooter's instinct, an almost supernatural ability to make accurate shots under pressure without conscious calculation. But that was the result of years of experience, not something that could be taught in 72 hours. "Commander Kane," Cross said, "assuming I can learn these techniques in time, what makes you confident they'll work during the actual demonstration? The pressure will be enormous." Kane's expression grew serious. "Lieutenant, that brings us to the third component of the training stress inoculation. We're going to deliberately create the most stressful shooting environment possible during practice, so that the actual demonstration feels manageable by comparison." Corporal Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. "More stressful than performing in front of Pentagon observers with your career on the line? I doubt that's possible." "You'd be surprised," Kane replied quietly. "Stress is relative. What feels overwhelming in training becomes routine in application." She turned back to Cross. "Lieutenant, I need absolute honesty. Are you volunteering because you believe in these methods, or because you're hoping to advance your career through high-visibility success?" The question caught Cross off guard. She'd been expecting technical questions about her readiness to learn new techniques, not psychological probing about her motivations. But after a moment of consideration, she realized the answer was important. "Both," she admitted. "I do think these methods might work, based on what you've described, but I'm also tired of being competent but not exceptional. If there's a chance to become truly elite rather than just adequate, I want to take it." Kane nodded approvingly. "That's the right answer. Ambition without capability leads to recklessness. Capability without ambition leads to mediocrity. You'll need both to succeed." She looked around the room at the assembled instructors. Gentlemen, Lieutenant Cross has volunteered to test these methods. Are you prepared to support her training, even if it means watching techniques that contradict everything you believe about proper marksmanship? The question was directed at everyone, but Kane was particularly interested in Holloway's response. As the senior instructor, his support or opposition would heavily influence the others. Holloway was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with conflicting impulses. Finally, he spoke. Commander Kane, I still believe your methods are fundamentally flawed. But Lieutenant Cross is a good soldier who deserves our support regardless of my personal opinions about the training she's chosen to undertake. He turned to Cross. Sarah, you have my full backing. If you're determined to do this, we'll make sure you have every resource and support we can provide. Kane felt a surge of satisfaction. Not enthusiasm, perhaps, but professional respect and institutional support. It was more than she'd received at some facilities. Thank you, Captain. Training begins in 6 hours. Lieutenant Cross, I suggest you get some rest. Tomorrow we start rebuilding everything you know about shooting. As the meeting broke up and people filed out of the room, Kane noticed the mixture of expressions on their faces. Curiosity, skepticism, concern, and in a few cases what might have been hope. In 72 hours, she would either validate that hope or destroy it completely. But as she watched Lieutenant Cross gathering her materials with the focused determination of someone who'd made a life-changing decision, Kane felt confident she'd chosen the right volunteer. Now came the hard part, making the impossible look inevitable. The pre-dawn darkness at Fort Meridian's Range Complex 7 was broken only by the harsh glare of floodlights illuminating what looked more like a science laboratory than a traditional shooting range. Commander Kane had spent the previous evening transforming the facility into something that would have been unrecognizable to conventional marksmanship instructors. Biometric monitoring stations lined one wall, their screens displaying real-time physiological data. Advanced ballistic computers hummed quietly in climate-controlled cases. Most striking of all, the traditional static targets had been replaced by a complex array of mechanical systems designed to create unpredictable movement patterns. Lieutenant Cross arrived at 0500 hours sharp, dressed in standard training fatigues but carrying an expression that mixed determination with barely concealed anxiety. She'd spent the night researching everything she could find about unconventional marksmanship techniques, though most of the scientific papers she'd discovered were classified or heavily redacted. Kane was already present, making final adjustments to a device that looked like a cross between a heart rate monitor and a sophisticated targeting computer. The crimson rifle that had drawn so much mockery the previous day was mounted in a precision rest nearby, its unusual coating seeming to absorb the harsh artificial light. "Morning, Lieutenant," Kane said without looking up from her equipment. "How did you sleep?" "Honestly, barely at all," Cross admitted. "I kept thinking about what I'd gotten myself into." Kane smiled approvingly. "Good. Anxiety means you understand the stakes. False confidence would be more concerning." She gestured toward the biometric station. "First things first, we need baseline measurements. Heart rate, blood pressure, stress hormone levels, fine motor control assessment." Cross approached the monitoring equipment with the wariness of someone entering unfamiliar territory. The sensors were more sophisticated than anything she'd encountered in standard training, designed to measure dozens of physiological parameters simultaneously. "Commander," she said as Kane began attaching monitoring leads, "yesterday you mentioned abandoning traditional fundamentals. Can you be more specific about what that means?" Kane paused in her work, considering how to explain concepts that most marksmen would find heretical. "Lieutenant, what's the first thing you were taught about rifle marksmanship? Proper shooting position, stable platform, consistent cheek weld, controlled breathing, steady trigger squeeze. And what's the purpose of those fundamentals?" Cross frowned slightly. "To eliminate variables, create consistency and repeatability." "Exactly," Kane said, resuming her equipment setup. "Traditional marksmanship is about creating artificial control in uncontrolled environments. But what if that approach actually limits performance rather than enhancing it?" The question challenged everything Cross had learned during 6 years of military service. How could control limit performance? Kane gestured toward the complex target array at the far end of the range. Because real threats don't cooperate with controlled environments. They move unpredictably, coordinate their actions, and specifically try to defeat marksmen who rely on static fundamentals. She activated the target system, and immediately the range filled with motion. Mechanical targets began moving in three-dimensional patterns, some following predictable arcs, others jerking erratically, still others moving in coordinated formations that seemed almost organic in their complexity. Traditional training teaches you to wait for the perfect shot, Kane continued, her voice barely audible over the mechanical sounds. Stable position, clear sight picture, controlled trigger squeeze. But against dynamic targets, waiting for perfect conditions means missing opportunities entirely. Cross watched the moving targets with growing unease. Some were moving faster than anything she'd ever attempted to engage. Others changed direction so unpredictably that tracking them seemed impossible. So what's the alternative? Kane walked over to her rifle and lifted it from the rest in one fluid motion. Adaptive targeting. Instead of forcing targets to conform to your preferred engagement parameters, you conform to their movement patterns. She shouldered the weapon without assuming any of the traditional shooting positions Cross had been taught. No stable bipod, no precise cheek weld, no controlled breathing pattern. Instead, Kane's stance was fluid, almost casual, as if she were holding a camera rather than a precision rifle. "Watch," Kane said quietly. The rifle spoke once, a suppressed crack that echoed off the range walls. Downrange, one of the moving targets, a small disc that had been jerking erratically through a figure-8 pattern, suddenly stopped moving. Perfect hit. Cross blinked in surprise. Kane had fired without any of the careful preparation that conventional doctrine demanded. No sight picture establishment, no breathing control, no deliberate trigger squeeze. Yet the shot had been perfect. "How?" Cross asked. Kane lowered the rifle and turned to face her. Pattern recognition. That target wasn't moving randomly, it was following an algorithm designed to appear random. Once you understand the underlying pattern, predicting position becomes possible. She gestured for Cross to approach the shooting position. Traditional marksmanship teaches you to fight your body's natural responses to stress. Elevated heart rate, increased respiration, adrenaline surge, all treated as enemies to be overcome. Cross nodded. Because they degrade fine motor control and precision. Only if you fight them, Kane corrected. But what if you learn to use them instead? Elevated heart rate increases blood flow to the brain, enhancing cognitive processing speed. Adrenaline sharpens focus and improves reaction time. Increased respiration delivers more oxygen to muscles, improving coordination. The concept was so contrary to everything Cross had learned that she struggled to process it. But everyone knows that stress degrades shooting performance. Kane handed her the crimson rifle, and Cross was surprised by how balanced it felt despite its unconventional appearance. Everyone knows that fighting stress degrades performance. Using stress properly enhances it. She activated another section of the target array, this one featuring slower-moving targets with more predictable patterns. We're going to start with pattern recognition exercises. I want you to watch these targets without trying to shoot them. Just observe and try to identify the underlying movement algorithms. Cross raised the rifle and peered through the scope, immediately falling into the traditional positions she'd been taught. Stable stance, controlled breathing, methodical target tracking. "Stop," Kane said immediately. "You're already reverting to conventional doctrine. Forget everything you think you know about proper shooting position." "But how can I be accurate without a stable platform?" Kane moved behind her and began adjusting her stance. Stability isn't about rigid positioning, it's about dynamic balance. Like a fighter pilot pulling high-G maneuvers or a gymnast performing on a balance beam. They maintain control through adaptability, not rigidity. The adjustments Kane made felt wrong to Cross's trained instincts. Her stance became more fluid, her grip lighter, her breathing natural rather than controlled. Everything contradicted her fundamental training. "This feels completely unstable," Cross protested. "Because you're comparing it to artificial stability, Kane explained. But artificial stability only works in artificial environments. Real combat requires real adaptability. For the next hour, Kane guided Cross through a series of exercises that systematically dismantled every conventional marksmanship technique she'd learned. Instead of fighting natural body movements, she learned to incorporate them. Instead of forcing controlled breathing, she learned to shoot between natural respiratory cycles. Instead of establishing perfect sight pictures, she learned to fire during brief windows of target predictability. At first, the results were disastrous. Cross missed targets she could have hit easily using conventional methods. Her shots went wide, low, high, anywhere except where she intended them to go. Frustration mounted with each failure. "This isn't working," she said after the 20th consecutive miss. "I was more accurate before we started." Kane checked the biometric readouts and nodded approvingly. "Your accuracy is down, but your target acquisition time has improved by 40%. Your natural shooting rhythm is adapting to dynamic conditions. What good is faster acquisition if I can't hit anything? Because accuracy will improve once your subconscious mind begins processing the new information patterns," Kane explained. "Right now, your conscious mind is fighting your muscle memory, but neural adaptation is already beginning." She pointed to specific data streams on the monitoring equipment. "Your stress response is stabilizing. Heart rate variability is decreasing. Brain wave patterns show increasing synchronization between cognitive and motor functions." Cross studied the readouts, trying to understand what they meant in practical terms. "How long before I can actually hit targets consistently?" Kane checked her chronometer. "Based on your adaptation rate, approximately 18 hours of intensive training, which means we'll be working through the night." The prospect of continuous training for the next 18 hours was daunting, but Cross found herself oddly exhilarated rather than discouraged. Something about the challenge, the complete departure from conventional methods, appealed to a part of her that had always felt constrained by rigid doctrine. "Commander," she said, raising the rifle again, "what happens if this doesn't work? If I can't master these techniques in time for the demonstration?" Kane's expression became serious. "Then we fail publicly, spectacularly, and probably permanently damage the credibility of unconventional marksmanship research." The honesty was both refreshing and terrifying. No false reassurances or empty confidence, just the stark reality of what they were attempting. "But," Kane added with a slight smile, "failure is only one possible outcome, and based on your neural adaptation patterns, it's becoming increasingly unlikely." Cross felt something shift in her mental approach to the training. Less fear, more curiosity. Less resistance, more openness to possibilities she couldn't yet comprehend. "All right," she said, settling into the unfamiliar shooting stance Kane had taught her. "Let's find out what's possible." The targets resumed their complex dance across the range, and Cross began the long process of learning to see patterns where others saw chaos. Hour 14 of continuous training marked the first moment when Lieutenant Cross began to understand what Commander Kane had been trying to teach her. It happened during what should have been a routine engagement sequence, 3 targets moving in overlapping figure-8 patterns at varying speeds. Cross had attempted this scenario dozens of times over the past several hours, each attempt ending in frustration as her shots consistently arrived where the targets had been rather than where they were going. But at 1847 hours, something clicked. Instead of consciously tracking individual targets, Cross found herself perceiving the entire movement pattern as a single, flowing system. Her breathing synchronized naturally with the target's rhythm. Her heart rate, which had been fluctuating wildly throughout the day, settled into a steady 128 beats per minute, elevated but stable. Most importantly, her rifle seemed to move independently of conscious thought, following trajectories that her analytical mind couldn't calculate but her trained instincts somehow understood. 3 shots in rapid succession. 3 perfect hits. Kane, who had been monitoring biometric data from her position behind the control station, looked up sharply at the sound of successful target eliminations. For the first time since training began, genuine excitement flickered across her usually controlled expression. "Lieutenant," she called out. "Maintain exactly that mental state and engage the next sequence." Cross barely heard the instruction. She was operating in what athletes sometimes called the zone, a state of heightened awareness where conscious thought became secondary to intuitive response. The rifle felt like an extension of her nervous system rather than an external tool. Her scope's reticle seemed to dance ahead of the targets, anticipating their movements with uncanny precision. 5 more shots. 5 more hits. The breakthrough had come so suddenly that Cross almost didn't trust it. After hours of missing targets that should have been simple, she was now engaging multiple moving objects with an accuracy that surpassed her best performance using conventional methods. "What just happened?" she asked, lowering the rifle and turning toward Kane. I know I hit the targets, but I'm not sure how." Kane was studying the biometric readouts with intense focus. "You stopped fighting your subconscious processing systems and started trusting them. Look at these neural activity patterns." She gestured to a display showing brain wave measurements. "For the past 13 hours, your prefrontal cortex has been in overdrive, trying to consciously calculate solutions to problems that require subconscious pattern recognition. But in the last sequence, activity shifted to your visual cortex and motor planning regions." Cross examined the data streams, though most of the scientific terminology was beyond her expertise. "So I was thinking too much?" "More precisely, you were thinking with the wrong parts of your brain," Kane corrected. "Conscious thought is excellent for logical analysis and deliberate problem solving, but it's too slow for real-time target engagement against multiple dynamic threats." She activated a new target array, this one featuring 7 objects moving in complex, seemingly random patterns. "Let's see if you can maintain that mental state under increased complexity." Cross raised the rifle again, but immediately felt the familiar tension of conscious interference creeping back into her awareness. The moment she began analyzing target movements logically, her performance degraded. Shots that should have connected sailed wide. The intuitive flow she'd experienced moments earlier evaporated. "I lost it," she said, frustration evident in her voice. "Whatever was working before, it's gone." Kane nodded calmly. "Expected. Transitioning between conscious and subconscious processing states takes practice. The key is recognizing when you're overthinking and learning to step back mentally." She walked over to Cross's position and began making subtle adjustments to her stance and grip. "Try this. Instead of analyzing the target's movements, I want you to imagine you're watching a dance. Don't predict where the dancers will go. Just enjoy the performance." The instruction seemed absurd for precision marksmanship, but Cross had learned to trust Kane's counterintuitive guidance. She relaxed her analytical focus and attempted to perceive the moving targets as elements of an aesthetic performance rather than problems to be solved. Almost immediately, the intuitive targeting state returned. Her rifle moved smoothly through engagement sequences that would have been impossible using conventional tracking methods. 7 targets, 7 hits, executed with a fluidity that felt more like choreography than combat. "Outstanding," Kane said, genuine admiration in her voice. "You're beginning to access performance capabilities that most marksmen never develop." Cross lowered the rifle, breathing hard despite the fact that the physical demands of the exercise had been minimal. "Commander, this is incredible, but I'm concerned about consistency. If I can't reliably enter this mental state, it's not tactically useful." Kane pulled up historical performance data from the monitoring systems. "Valid concern. But look at your progression over the past 4 hours. Each time you've accessed the enhanced state, you've returned to it more quickly after losing it. Neural pathway reinforcement is accelerating." The data showed clear improvement trends. Recovery time from performance degradation was decreasing, accuracy during enhanced states was increasing, and most encouragingly, the duration of enhanced performance windows was extending. "How much more training do we need?" Cross asked. Kane checked her chronometer and ran quick calculations on her tablet. Based on current progression rates, approximately 6 more hours of intensive practice should establish sufficient neural pathway stability for reliable performance under stress. "And then we test everything under simulated demonstration conditions," Kane replied. "Maximum stress, Pentagon-level observation protocols, single-attempt success requirements." The prospect was both exhilarating and terrifying. Cross had spent her entire military career training for scenarios where second chances were available, where failed attempts could be analyzed and corrected. The Gauntlet Protocol demonstration would offer no such luxury. "Commander," she said, "assuming I can master these techniques reliably, what are the actual chances of perfect performance on 47 moving targets?" Kane's expression became uncharacteristically serious. "Honestly, using conventional methods, the chances would be essentially zero. The mathematical probability of 47 consecutive hits on unpredictably moving targets is astronomically low. And using your methods? Still challenging but achievable. The key difference is that enhanced pattern recognition allows you to engage targets during brief windows of predictability, rather than attempting to track purely random movements." Kane activated the most complex target array yet, 15 objects moving in coordinated but constantly changing formations. The Gauntlet Protocol isn't actually random. It's a sophisticated algorithm designed to appear random while maintaining underlying mathematical structures. Once you can perceive those structures, Cross raised her rifle and immediately felt the enhanced targeting state engage. The 15 targets weren't moving chaotically, they were executing variations on a complex theme, like musicians improvising within a structured framework. Her shots found their marks with mechanical precision, each hit occurring during microsecond windows when target positions became briefly predictable. 15 shots, 15 hits. Total engagement time, 47 seconds. Kane studied the performance data with growing excitement. "Lieutenant, you just achieved targeting accuracy that exceeds current military benchmarks by over 200%. Cross felt a surge of confidence that was immediately tempered by the magnitude of what lay ahead. 15 targets was impressive, but the Gauntlet Protocol demanded 47. The mathematical progression wasn't linear. Each additional target exponentially increased complexity. 6 more hours, she said, more to herself than to Kane. "Can we really be ready?" Kane smiled with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen impossible achievements become routine through proper preparation. "Lieutenant Cross, 6 hours ago you couldn't hit 3 moving targets consistently. Now you're engaging 15 with perfect accuracy. The question isn't whether we can be ready. It's whether Fort Meridian is prepared to have its understanding of human capability completely redefined." As if summoned by her words, the range door opened and Captain Holloway stepped inside, followed by several other instructors who had come to observe the training progress. Their expressions showed a mixture of curiosity and skepticism that immediately shifted to stunned disbelief as they witnessed Cross's performance against the complex target array. Staff Sergeant Vasquez stood motionless, watching targets fall with mechanical precision to shots that seemed to defy conventional ballistics. "That's impossible," he muttered, though the evidence was undeniable. Kane noticed the observers but didn't interrupt Cross's training rhythm. This was exactly the kind of validation she'd hoped for, peer witnesses who could testify that the enhanced performance was real, measurable, and repeatable. "Gentlemen," she said quietly, "you're watching the future of military marksmanship. In 30 hours, that future would either be validated spectacularly or destroyed forever." But as Cross continued engaging targets with superhuman precision, Kane felt confident that history was about to be made. The problems began 18 hours before the scheduled demonstration, when Lieutenant Cross should have been in her final preparation phase. Instead, she was lying in Fort Meridian's medical facility, connected to 4 fluids and monitoring equipment, her face pale with exhaustion and her hands trembling from what the base physician had diagnosed as severe neural fatigue. Commander Kane stood beside the medical bed, studying readouts that told a story she'd hoped never to see again. Cross's biometric data showed the unmistakable signs of cognitive overload, a condition that occurred when the human brain was pushed beyond its adaptive limits during intensive neural retraining protocols. "How bad is it?" Cross asked weakly, though her voice carried more concern about the demonstration than her own condition. Dr. Rebecca Torres, Fort Meridian's chief medical officer, reviewed the test results with the clinical detachment of someone delivering unwelcome news. "Lieutenant, your cortisol levels are dangerously elevated. Your neural activity patterns show signs of severe overstimulation, and your fine motor control has degraded by 30% from baseline measurements. Kane closed her eyes briefly, recognizing the symptoms from similar incidents during her early experimental work. Pushing neural adaptation too rapidly could cause temporary but debilitating cognitive dysfunction. Exactly what they couldn't afford with Pentagon observers arriving in less than a day. Can she recover in time? Kane asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Dr. Torres shook her head firmly. Absolutely not. Lieutenant Cross needs a minimum of 72 hours of complete cognitive rest to avoid potential long-term neurological damage. Any attempt to continue intensive training would be medically irresponsible. The implications hit Kane like a physical blow. Without Cross, there was no demonstration. Without the demonstration, Fort Meridian would lose its elite status, her experimental methods would be discredited, and years of research would be wasted. But more immediately, they would have to face Colonel Hawthorne and explain why they destroyed their volunteers' health while failing to produce any meaningful results. Cross struggled to sit up despite the 4 lines. Commander, there has to be something we can do. Maybe reduced intensity training or... No, Dr. Torres interrupted firmly. Lieutenant, you're experiencing the neurological equivalent of severe muscle strain. Attempting to continue would be like running a marathon on a broken leg. Kane studied Cross's condition with growing desperation. The young officer had made tremendous progress, achieving targeting capabilities that exceeded anything in current military doctrine. But progress meant nothing if it couldn't be demonstrated when it mattered most. There is one alternative, Kane said slowly, the words feeling heavy as she spoke them. Both Cross and Dr. Torres looked at her expectantly. I could perform the demonstration myself. The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge to the laws of physics. Cross was the volunteer, the test subject, the proof that Kane's methods could transform conventional marksmen into exceptional performers. Kane stepping in as a replacement would undermine the entire premise of the experiment. Cross shook her head weakly. Commander, you can't do that. The Pentagon observers are expecting to see enhanced training methods, not individual exceptional performance. If you demonstrate the techniques yourself, they'll assume it's just personal talent rather than teachable skills. Kane knew Cross was right, but the alternatives were even worse. What if we postpone the demonstration? Request additional time for training? Impossible, came a new voice from the medical facility entrance. Colonel Hawthorne entered with an expression that suggested she'd already heard about Cross's condition. Pentagon observers arrive tonight. The demonstration schedule is fixed, and postponement would be interpreted as failure. Kane felt the weight of institutional pressure settling around her like a closing trap. Colonel, Lieutenant Cross has achieved remarkable progress, but she needs recovery time before she can perform reliably. Hawthorne studied the medical readouts with the clinical assessment of someone who'd spent decades managing personnel crises. How remarkable! Kane pulled up training footage on her tablet, showing Cross's final successful engagement sequence. 15 moving targets eliminated in 47 seconds with perfect accuracy. She exceeded conventional performance benchmarks by over 200%. Hawthorne watched the footage twice before responding. Impressive, but not sufficient for our purposes. The Pentagon observers aren't interested in incremental improvements. They want revolutionary capability demonstration, which she can provide, Kane insisted, given adequate recovery time, which we don't have, Hawthorne countered firmly. Commander Kane, I need a realistic assessment. What are our options? Kane had been dreading this moment since Cross's collapse. We can cancel the demonstration and accept the consequences, or we can proceed with modified parameters. What kind of modifications? Kane hesitated before responding. We could reduce target complexity, extend engagement time, or lower success criteria from perfect performance to substantial improvement over baseline. Hawthorne's expression made it clear that none of these options were acceptable. Commander, half measures won't satisfy Pentagon requirements. They're expecting to see capabilities that justify continued investment in unconventional training research. Dr. Torres, who had been quietly monitoring Cross's condition, suddenly spoke up. There might be another option. Both Kane and Hawthorne turned toward her expectantly. Pharmacological enhancement, Dr. Torres said carefully. Controlled stimulants combined with neural stabilizers could temporarily counteract the fatigue effects and restore functional performance. Kane felt her stomach clench. Pharmaceutical performance enhancement was dangerous territory. Effective but potentially harmful, particularly for someone already experiencing neural strain. What are the risks? Hawthorne asked. Dr. Torres consulted her medical references before responding. Cardiovascular stress, potential for dependency, unknown interactions with existing neurological fatigue. In Lieutenant Cross's current condition, it would be medically inadvisable. Cross, who had been listening to the exchange with growing alarm, finally spoke up. I'll do it. Lieutenant, Dr. Torres began. I'll do it, Cross repeated more firmly. This demonstration isn't just about my career or Commander Kane's research. It's about proving that enhanced human capability is possible. If there's a chance to succeed, I have to take it. Kane studied Cross's determined expression and recognized something she'd seen in her own mirror years earlier, the willingness to risk everything for the chance to achieve something truly exceptional. The decision isn't yours to make, Dr. Torres said firmly. Medical protocols require. Medical protocols can be overridden by command authority, Hawthorne interrupted. The question is whether the potential benefits justify the risks. Kane found herself at the center of an impossible choice. Allow Cross to risk her health for a demonstration that might fail anyway, or cancel everything and accept professional disgrace. Neither option felt acceptable, but time was running out. There's a third alternative, Kane said slowly, an idea forming that she'd been reluctant to consider. Which is? Kane looked directly at Cross. We modify the demonstration parameters. Instead of 47 sequential targets, we use 47 simultaneous targets with extended engagement time. Hawthorne frowned. How does that help? Because simultaneous targeting relies more on pattern recognition than sustained performance. Lieutenant Cross has already demonstrated exceptional pattern recognition capability. The question is whether she can apply it under extreme stress. Cross's eyes brightened slightly. Like the 15-target array, but scaled up? Exactly. More complex but requiring shorter duration peak performance. Dr. Torres shook her head. That's still an enormous cognitive load for someone in her condition. Kane checked her chronometer. 17 hours until the demonstration. Barely enough time to modify the target systems and run basic functionality tests. Colonel, she said finally, I recommend we proceed with the modified parameters. It's our best chance of success given the circumstances. Hawthorne was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing options that all carried significant risks. Very well, but understand that failure won't be attributed to circumstances. It will be attributed to inadequate preparation and poor judgment. As if the pressure weren't already overwhelming enough. But Kane nodded acceptance. Understood, ma'am. What none of them realized was that the real test hadn't even begun yet. In 17 hours, Lieutenant Cross would face challenges that would make her current condition seem trivial by comparison. At 0600 hours on demonstration day, the atmosphere at Fort Meridian's Range Complex 7 crackled with tension that bordered on the electric. Pentagon observers had arrived during the night, 3 generals, 2 colonels, and a civilian analyst whose security clearance was so high that his name didn't appear on any official roster. They stood in the observation tower, their expressions carrying the professional skepticism of people who had seen countless demonstrations that promised revolutionary capabilities but delivered marginal improvements. Lieutenant Cross sat in the preparation area, connected to medical monitoring equipment, while Dr. Torres administered the final round of pharmaceutical enhancement cocktails. The stimulants coursed through her system like liquid fire, sharpening her awareness while simultaneously making her feel detached from her own body. Her hands had stopped trembling, but her heart rate held steady at an elevated 145 beats per minute. Commander Kane made final adjustments to the modified target array, a mechanical symphony of 47 drone units positioned throughout the range in a 3-dimensional formation that would have been impossible with conventional static targets. Each drone was programmed with individual movement algorithms, But Kane had spent the previous night identifying the underlying mathematical relationships that connected their seemingly random patterns. 5 minutes to demonstration, Colonel Hawthorne announced over the facility's communication system, her voice carrying across the range with military precision. Cross stood up slowly, testing her balance and coordination. The pharmaceutical enhancement had restored much of her cognitive function, but she could feel the artificial nature of her current state. Everything seemed hyper-real, colors more vivid, sounds more distinct. Her awareness expanded beyond normal human parameters. "How do you feel?" Kane asked, approaching with the crimson rifle that had started this entire journey. "Like I'm watching myself from outside my own body," Cross replied honestly. "But functional. Maybe more than functional." Kane handed her the rifle and immediately noticed the difference in how Cross received it. Her movements were precise but fluid, her grip confident without being tense. The pharmaceutical enhancement seemed to be amplifying the neural pathways they developed during training rather than simply masking fatigue. "Remember," Kane said quietly, "this isn't about perfect accuracy on individual targets. It's about recognizing the overall pattern and engaging during windows of optimal predictability." Cross nodded, though her attention was already shifting toward the target array. With her enhanced awareness, she could perceive movement patterns that had been invisible during normal consciousness. The 47 drones weren't moving randomly, they were executing variations on a complex dance that her trained mind could now decode. "Lieutenant Cross," came a voice from the observation tower. Brigadier General Marcus Steinberg, the senior Pentagon observer, had activated the range communication system. "We understand you'll be demonstrating enhanced marksmanship techniques developed by Commander Kane. What should we expect to see?" Cross keyed her microphone, surprised by how steady her voice sounded despite her elevated physiological state. "General, you'll see engagement of 47 moving targets using predictive pattern recognition rather than conventional tracking methods. And your expected success rate?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone present understood that anything less than exceptional performance would be interpreted as failure. 100%, sir." The declaration was met with silence from the observation tower. 100% success against 47 moving targets was the kind of claim that ended careers if not supported by results. Kane activated the target array, and immediately the range filled with motion. 47 drones launched simultaneously, their movements creating a three-dimensional ballet of mechanical precision. To most observers, it looked like chaos, objects moving in every direction at varying speeds with no apparent coordination. But Cross, operating in her pharmacologically enhanced state, perceived something entirely different. The movement patterns resolved into a comprehensible system, like looking at a complex musical score and suddenly understanding the underlying harmony. Her rifle moved smoothly to the first firing position. The opening shot came without conscious thought, her weapon speaking at the precise moment when 3 movement algorithms intersected to create a window of predictability. The first drone tumbled from its flight path, its elimination triggering a cascade of pattern modifications throughout the remaining array. Cross didn't pause to confirm the hit. Her rifle was already tracking to the second engagement point, then the third, her movements flowing with mechanical precision. Shot after shot found its mark as she worked through the algorithmic sequence she could perceive but not consciously explain. 10 targets down. 20. 30. In the observation tower, the Pentagon observers watched in stunned silence as Lieutenant Cross demonstrated capabilities that challenged their understanding of human performance limitations. General Steinberg found himself leaning forward involuntarily, trying to comprehend how a single marksman could maintain perfect accuracy against so many simultaneous moving targets. "Is this real?" Colonel Patricia Manning asked quietly, her question directed at no one in particular. Kane monitored Cross's performance through biometric displays that showed physiological parameters at the absolute limits of human tolerance. Heart rate 165 BPM, stress hormones at peak levels, neural activity patterns indicating cognitive processing speeds far beyond normal ranges. 40 targets eliminated. 7 remaining. Cross's enhanced awareness began to flicker as the pharmaceutical enhancement reached its metabolic limits. The remaining drones seemed to blur at the edges of her perception, their movement patterns becoming less distinct. Fatigue pressed against her consciousness like rising water. But she had come too far to fail now. Drawing on reserves she didn't know she possessed, Cross forced her awareness to crystallize one final time. The last 7 targets snapped into perfect clarity, their movements revealing the concluding sequence of the algorithmic pattern. 7 shots in rapid succession. 7 perfect hits. 47 targets. 47 eliminations. 0 misses. The range fell silent except for the mechanical sounds of target systems powering down. In the observation tower, hardened military professionals stared at data displays that showed performance metrics beyond anything in their experience. Cross lowered her rifle with hands that were beginning to shake again as the pharmaceutical enhancement faded. She had achieved the impossible, but the cost was becoming apparent. Her vision blurred at the edges, and she felt the familiar symptoms of neural fatigue returning with compound interest. Outstanding performance, Lieutenant. General Steinberg's voice came through the communication system, though his tone carried disbelief alongside admiration. We'd like to discuss the training methodology that produced these results. Kane moved quickly to Cross's side as the young officer swayed slightly on her feet. The demonstration had been successful beyond all expectations, but the price was becoming clear. Cross needed immediate medical attention. Medical team to range 7. Kane called over the emergency frequency, then turned back to Cross. You did it. Perfect performance under impossible conditions. Cross managed a weak smile. Did we prove your methods work? Kane looked toward the observation tower where Pentagon officials were engaged in intense discussion about what they'd just witnessed. Lieutenant, I think we just changed everything. But as Dr. Torres rushed toward them with emergency medical equipment, Kane realized that proving the possible and sustaining the impossible were entirely different challenges. The real test was just beginning. The silence in the observation tower stretched for nearly 2 full minutes after Lieutenant Cross's final shot. 2 minutes during which some of the most experienced military leaders in the Pentagon stared at performance data that challenged fundamental assumptions about human capability. 47 moving targets. 47 perfect hits. 0 margin for error, 0 room for doubt. Brigadier General Marcus Steinberg was the first to break the silence, his gravelly voice carrying the weight of 30 years in military service. Gentlemen, I've witnessed advances in weapons technology, tactical innovation, and strategic doctrine that have redefined modern warfare. But what we just observed transcends technological enhancement. This represents a fundamental evolution in human performance capability. Colonel Patricia Manning, the Pentagon's senior analyst for Special Operations Readiness, was studying the biometric data from Cross's demonstration with intense focus. General, these physiological readings are extraordinary. Heart rate sustained above 160 BPM for the entire engagement, stress hormones at peak levels, yet fine motor control remained perfect throughout. The civilian analyst, whose name badge simply read Dr. Chan, pulled up comparative data on his secure tablet. The mathematical probability of achieving perfect accuracy against 47 independently moving targets using conventional methods is approximately 1 in 847 million. What Lieutenant Cross accomplished shouldn't be physically possible. Down on the range, Kane was coordinating with Dr. Torres to ensure Cross received immediate medical attention. The young officer had remained conscious but was showing signs of severe exhaustion as the pharmaceutical enhancement wore off. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, and her cognitive responses were becoming increasingly delayed. Get her to medical immediately, Kane instructed the emergency team. Full neurological assessment and monitoring. I want to know the exact physiological cost of this performance level. As Cross was transferred to a medical gurney, she managed to grab Kane's arm with surprising strength. Commander, she said, her voice hoarse but determined. Did it work? Did we prove your methods? Kane looked toward the observation tower where the Pentagon officials were engaged in what appeared to be heated discussion. Lieutenant, you just demonstrated capabilities that will reshape military doctrine for decades. Whatever happens next, you've proven that human potential extends far beyond current assumptions. Cross nodded weakly before the medical team wheeled her toward the facility's emergency treatment area. Kane watched her go with a mixture of pride and concern. The demonstration had been successful beyond all expectations, but the physical cost was becoming apparent. Captain Holloway approached Kane's position, his expression a complex mixture of amazement and professional reevaluation. "Commander Kane," he said formally, "I owe you an apology. What I just witnessed contradicts everything I thought I knew about marksmanship fundamentals." Kane turned to face him, noting that Staff Sergeant Vasquez, Sergeant Rodriguez, and several other previously skeptical instructors had gathered nearby. Their body language had transformed completely from the hostility she'd encountered just days earlier. "Captain," she replied, "your skepticism was professionally appropriate. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." Vasquez stepped forward, his voice carrying newfound respect. "Commander, that wasn't just extraordinary evidence, that was impossible made routine. How long have you been developing these techniques?" 8 years of field research, 3 years of formal methodology development, 18 months of controlled testing, Kane replied. Lieutenant Cross achieved in 72 hours what typically requires months of training because she possessed optimal psychological and neurological characteristics for rapid adaptation. Sergeant Rodriguez frowned thoughtfully. "Are you saying not everyone can learn these methods?" Kane had been expecting this question and had prepared a carefully considered response. Everyone can improve beyond their current baseline, but exceptional performance requires specific cognitive and physiological traits. Lieutenant Cross represents perhaps the top 5% of potential candidates. Before anyone could respond, Colonel Hawthorne's voice echoed across the range through the facility's communication system. "Commander Kane, report to the observation tower immediately." Kane felt her stomach tighten. The tone suggested this wasn't a congratulatory summoning. She climbed the stairs to the observation tower with measured steps, trying to read the expressions of the assembled Pentagon officials. General Steinberg gestured for her to approach the central briefing area where multiple data displays showed detailed analysis of Cross's performance. "Commander Kane, we need to understand exactly what we witnessed today." "Sir." Lieutenant Cross demonstrated enhanced marksmanship techniques based on predictive pattern recognition and optimized stress response protocols. "Be more specific," Colonel Manning interjected. "The performance data suggests capabilities that exceed normal human parameters. Are we looking at pharmaceutical enhancement, technological augmentation, or something else entirely?" Kane chose her words carefully. The techniques utilize natural human cognitive capabilities that are typically suppressed by conventional training methods. No technological augmentation was employed, though pharmaceutical support was necessary due to Lieutenant Cross's pre-existing training fatigue. Dr. Chun looked up from his analysis tablet. "Commander, the neural activity patterns we recorded show processing speeds that approach theoretical maximum limits for human cognition. How sustainable are these performance levels?" The question struck at the heart of Kane's concerns. "Sir, current data suggests that peak performance can be maintained for limited durations without permanent physiological damage. Extended use would require careful medical monitoring." General Steinberg leaned back in his chair, clearly weighing implications that extended far beyond the immediate demonstration. "Commander, assuming these methods can be refined and safely implemented, what would be the training requirements for broader application?" Kane had prepared for this question, though the answer was complex. "General, implementing these techniques across existing marksmanship programs would require complete restructuring of current doctrine, specialized instructor training, enhanced medical support, and careful candidate selection. Timeline, conservative estimate, 18 months for instructor certification, 24 months for initial operational capability, 36 months for full program implementation." Colonel Manning exchanged glances with General Steinberg. "What about immediate applications? Could these techniques be employed for specific high-priority operations?" Kane felt the conversation shifting toward operational deployment considerations. "Ma'am, with proper candidate selection and intensive training protocols, limited implementation could be achieved in 6 to 8 weeks. The observation tower fell quiet as the Pentagon officials processed the implications. Kane realized she was witnessing the moment when experimental research transitioned into potential military doctrine. General Steinberg finally spoke. "Commander Kane, effective immediately, you're assigned to Pentagon's Strategic Development Division. Your mission is to develop comprehensive implementation protocols for enhanced marksmanship training across special operations units." The assignment was both vindication and enormous responsibility. Kane had proven her methods worked, but now she would be accountable for transforming experimental techniques into reliable military capabilities. "Sir, what about Fort Meridian? The facility's existing programs will be restructured around your methodologies," Colonel Manning replied. "Captain Holloway and his team will serve as your initial instructor candidates." Kane looked through the observation tower windows toward the range where her colleagues were still discussing what they'd witnessed. In the space of a single demonstration, everything had changed. Her methods were no longer experimental curiosities. They were the foundation for a new era in military marksmanship. But as she thought about Lieutenant Cross recovering in the medical facility, Kane reminded herself that extraordinary capability always carried extraordinary cost. The challenge ahead wouldn't be proving what was possible, but ensuring it could be achieved safely and sustainably. The future of military marksmanship had just been redefined. Now came the harder task of making that future operational reality. 6 months after the demonstration that shattered every assumption about human marksmanship capability, Commander Alexis Kane stood before a congressional subcommittee in a sterile briefing room deep within the Pentagon. The walls were lined with classified performance data, operational reports, and testimonials from field commanders who had witnessed the impossible become routine. The enhanced human performance marksmanship program had exceeded every projection. Across 12 different special operations units, marksmen trained in Kane's methodologies had achieved success rates that redefined tactical possibilities. Mission parameters previously considered impossible were now standard operating procedure. Enemy forces that had relied on mobility and evasion to counter conventional snipers found themselves facing adversaries who could predict movement patterns and engage targets with supernatural precision. "Commander Kane," said Congresswoman Elena Rodriguez, the subcommittee chairwoman whose security clearance allowed her access to operational details that would remain classified for decades. "Your program's results are remarkable, but we need to address sustainability concerns. What is the long-term physiological impact on operators who utilize these enhanced techniques?" Kane had been anticipating this question since the program's inception. "Congresswoman, our medical data from 6 months of operational deployment shows that properly trained operators experience no permanent physiological damage when techniques are employed within established parameters. However, the training process requires careful medical monitoring, and not all candidates are suitable for the program." Senator James Mitchell, a former military officer whose understanding of special operations ran deep, leaned forward in his chair. "Commander, can you quantify the improvement in mission success rates?" Kane activated a secure display showing operational statistics that told a story of transformed capability. "Senator, missions utilizing enhanced marksmanship operators show a 43% improvement in primary objective completion, 67% reduction in collateral damage, and an 81% decrease in ammunition expenditure." The numbers represented more than statistical improvements. They reflected lives saved, operations succeeded, and strategic objectives achieved with unprecedented efficiency. But Kane knew the human cost behind those statistics. Lieutenant Sarah Cross, now Captain Cross following her promotion and assignment as the program's senior training coordinator, entered the briefing room carrying the latest assessment reports from Fort Meridian's expanded facilities. Her recovery from the initial demonstration had been complete, though she bore subtle changes that marked her as one of the enhanced operators. Her movements held an economy and precision that hadn't been present before her transformation. Her awareness seemed expanded, as if she processed environmental information at multiple levels simultaneously. Most remarkably, her shooting capabilities had stabilized at levels that defied conventional understanding of human limits. "Congresswoman Rodriguez," Cross said, addressing the subcommittee with the confidence of someone who had achieved the impossible, "I'd like to address the sustainability question from an operator's perspective." Rodriguez nodded. "Please proceed, Captain. 6 months ago, I was a competent marksman who struggled with dynamic target scenarios. Today, I can engage 47 moving targets with perfect accuracy while maintaining situational awareness of multiple threat vectors. The enhancement isn't temporary. It's permanent improvement in cognitive and physical coordination. Senator Mitchell studied Cross with the analytical gaze of someone who understood that extraordinary capability often carried hidden costs. Captain, what about psychological effects? Operating at superhuman performance levels must create unique stresses. Cross exchanged a glance with Kane before responding. Senator, the psychological adaptation has been significant. Enhanced awareness means processing information that most people filter out subconsciously. Sound patterns, movement algorithms, environmental variables that were previously background noise now demand attention. Is that problematic? It's different, Cross replied honestly. Like learning to see colors that don't exist for most people. Sometimes overwhelming, but ultimately advantageous for operational effectiveness. Kane noted the careful way Cross described her transformation. They had discussed the psychological implications extensively during her recovery and ongoing assessment. Enhanced operators didn't just shoot better, they perceived reality differently, processing information at speeds and volumes that created unique challenges for social and professional integration. Congresswoman Rodriguez consulted her classified briefing materials. Commander Kane, what are the program's expansion limitations? Could these techniques be implemented across conventional military units? Kane had been dreading this question because the answer challenged political expectations about democratic access to enhancement. Congresswoman, approximately 5% of military personnel possess the neurological and psychological characteristics necessary for successful enhancement. Attempting to force the process on unsuitable candidates results in cognitive damage without performance improvement. The implication was clear. Enhanced marksmanship wasn't a training program that could be universally applied. It was a selection and development process that identified rare individuals capable of transcending normal human limitations. Senator Mitchell frowned. So we're talking about creating an elite within an elite? Enhanced operators who fundamentally differ from conventional personnel. That's correct, Senator, Kane replied. Though I prefer to think of it as identifying and developing existing potential rather than creating artificial enhancement. Captain Cross stepped forward. Senator, if I may add a perspective from the field, conventional operators remain essential for the majority of military functions. Enhanced marksmanship addresses specific tactical scenarios that require capabilities beyond normal human parameters. We're not replacing conventional forces. We're adding specialized capability. The distinction was important for political and practical reasons. The Enhanced Human Performance Marksmanship Program couldn't become a general enhancement initiative because the techniques only worked for candidates with specific characteristics. But for those rare individuals who could adapt, the transformation was profound and permanent. Congresswoman Rodriguez checked her chronometer. Final question, Commander Kane. 5 years from now, what do you envision for this program? Kane considered her response carefully. Congresswoman, I envision approximately 200 enhanced operators distributed across special operations units worldwide. These individuals will provide capabilities that enable mission success in scenarios currently considered impossible. They will operate with support from conventional forces and advanced technology, but they will represent the absolute pinnacle of human marksmanship potential. And the red rifle that started this journey? Kane smiled, thinking about the weapon that had drawn so much mockery and ultimately proven so transformative. The rifle was just a tool, Congresswoman. The real innovation was recognizing that human potential extends far beyond conventional assumptions. The enhanced operators we're developing will use whatever weapons serve their missions, but their true capability lies in how they think, perceive, and respond to complex challenges. As the subcommittee concluded its session and classified the testimony under the highest security protocols, Kane reflected on how far they'd come from that first day when laughter greeted her unconventional methods. The mockery had been replaced by awe, the skepticism by institutional support, and the impossible had become operational reality. Captain Cross joined her in the corridor outside the briefing room. Commander, Do you ever wonder what would have happened if that first demonstration had failed? Kane considered the question. Every day, Captain, but I've learned that extraordinary achievement requires extraordinary risk. We succeeded not because failure was impossible, but because we were willing to accept the consequences of attempting something unprecedented. Looking through the Pentagon's bulletproof windows toward the Virginia countryside beyond, Kane realized that the Enhanced Human Performance Marksmanship program represented more than military innovation. It demonstrated that human potential, properly understood and developed, could transcend seemingly absolute limitations. The red rifle that had prompted laughter was now displayed in the Pentagon's classified exhibition hall, marking the moment when mockery became legend and impossibility became routine. And in training facilities around the world, carefully selected candidates were learning to see patterns where others saw chaos, to find precision in disorder, and to achieve what their predecessors could only dream of. The future belonged to those willing to challenge assumptions about what was possible. And Lieutenant Cross's 47 perfect shots had proven that the impossible was simply another training objective waiting to be achieved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.